Sometimes the treasure we find isn't the blessing we thought we needed. Deep in the Bitterroot Mountains of Montana, where the autumn wind cuts through pine needles like whispered secrets, Bear Whitmore stood before a hut that looked like it might collapse if he breathed too hard. The October sky pressed down gray and heavy, matching the weight in his chest as he thought about the foreclosure notice tucked in his truck's glove compartment. 3 generations of Whitmore cattle had grazed these mountain valleys, but the bank didn't care about legacy, only payments Bear couldn't make since Martha's cancer treatments had drained their savings dry. His dead brother's final joke, willing him this worthless shack, seemed cruel even by Tommy's standards. But when Bear's boot punched through the rotted floorboards, revealing a hidden chamber below, his flashlight illuminated something impossible. Canvas upon canvas of paintings wrapped in oilcloth, their gilded frames catching the light like buried gold. The signature in the corner of one canvas made his hands shake, a name he recognized from Martha's art history books. But why would priceless masterpieces be hidden in a mountain prospector's hut? And what did his grandfather really do during the war? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Bear's knees cracked as he lowered himself through the broken floorboards, his weathered hands gripping the rough-hewn edges for support. At 62, every joint in his body carried the accumulated ache of decades spent wrestling cattle, mending fence, and fighting a land that gave back only what it chose to. The chamber beneath was barely 5 feet deep, forcing him into an awkward crouch as his flashlight beam swept across the hidden space. The paintings leaned against the earthen walls like sleeping ghosts. Dozens of them, maybe more. He'd lost count after 20. Each canvas was wrapped with the meticulous care of someone who understood their value, protected by layers of oilcloth and what looked like military-issue waterproofing. The air down here held a different quality, dry and preserved, as if time itself had been suspended. Bear reached for the nearest painting with trembling fingers. The signature he'd glimpsed, Van Gogh, seemed to pulse in the yellow beam of his flashlight. But that was impossible. Van Gogh paintings hung in museums, not rotting mountain shacks. He'd seen Martha pore over her art books enough times to recognize the swirling brushstrokes, the violent beauty that made the Dutch master famous. A sound outside made him freeze, just whined through the pines, but it reminded him how alone he was up here. The nearest neighbor lived 40 miles down the mountain, and Bear hadn't told anyone where he was going today. Hell, he hadn't planned on coming himself until the lawyer's letter arrived 3 days ago, informing him that his brother Tommy had left him this mining claim and associated structures in the Bitterroots. Tommy, who'd run off to Seattle 30 years ago and never looked back. Tommy, who'd missed their father's funeral, their mother's funeral, and every family crisis in between. Tommy, who'd somehow acquired a piece of mountain property without ever mentioning it to his only living relative. Bear climbed back through the floorboards, his mind racing. The October air felt sharp against his skin after the musty chamber below. He pulled out his phone, no signal, as expected, and stared at the crumbling hut with new eyes. From the outside it looked like every other abandoned prospector's cabin scattered through these mountains. Weathered logs, a collapsed chimney, windows boarded with plywood that had gone grey with age. But someone had built that hidden chamber. Someone had carefully transported priceless artwork up a nearly impassable mountain road and stored it like buried treasure. The sound of his truck's engine ticking as it cooled reminded him of the real world waiting below. The foreclosure notice gave him 60 days before the bank seized the Whitmore Ranch, 4,000 acres of prime Montana cattle country that his great-grandfather had homesteaded in 1892, the same land where Bear had taken his first steps, learned to ride, married Martha in the meadow behind the main house. The same land he was about to lose because he'd mortgaged everything to pay for treatments that only bought Martha an extra 6 months. Bear walked a slow circle around the hut, noting details he'd missed in his initial shock. The building sat on a foundation of stacked stone, professionally laid. The roof had collapsed in places, but the underlying structure showed quality workmanship. And the location, tucked into a natural bowl surrounded by dense timber, would be invisible from any angle unless you knew exactly where to look. A piece of metal caught his eye, half buried beneath fallen pine needles. He brushed away the debris and revealed a small brass plaque, green with oxidation. The lettering was barely visible, property of the Whitmore Mining Consortium, EST. 1943. His grandfather's name was etched at the bottom, Heinrich Whitmore, managing partner. Bear stared at the plaque, his pulse quickening. Heinrich had died when Bear was 12, but the old man's stories still echoed through family dinners, tales of Montana homesteading, of fighting in the Pacific Theater, of building the ranch from nothing but sweat and stubbornness. Heinrich Whitmore, decorated war hero and pillar of the community. But this plaque was dated 1943. Heinrich had supposedly been overseas then, island hopping with the Marines. And why would a cattle rancher establish a mining consortium in the middle of nowhere? The wind picked up, sending dried leaves skittering across the hut's threshold. Bear shivered and pulled his jacket tighter. The smart thing would be to leave, drive back down the mountain, and pretend he'd never punched through those floorboards. Whatever was happening here felt bigger than a simple inheritance, more complicated than his desperate need for money. But the foreclosure notice was real, and those paintings, if they were authentic, represented more than enough money to save the ranch and secure Martha's memory. Bear took one last look at the hidden chamber below, then headed for his truck. He needed answers, and he knew exactly where to start looking. Back at the ranch house, in the trunk his grandfather had left in the attic, the one Bear had never bothered to open. As he drove down the winding mountain road, Bear couldn't shake the feeling that he'd just crossed a line he couldn't uncross, stepping into a story that had been waiting 60 years to be told. The drive down from the mountains took Bear through 40 miles of switchbacks and gravel roads that hadn't seen county maintenance in a decade. His truck suspension groaned with each pothole, a sound that reminded him of everything else falling apart in his life. The sun was setting by the time he reached the valley floor, painting the ranch buildings in the golden light Martha used to love. The Whitmore Ranch spread across the valley like a patchwork of memories, each fence line and pasture carrying the weight of 4 generations. The main house sat in a grove of cottonwoods his great-grandfather had planted, a 2-story log structure that had grown organically over the decades as each generation added rooms and porches according to their needs. Bear could see the newer wing he'd built for Martha when her arthritis made climbing stairs difficult. The windows dark now for almost 2 years. He parked beside the barn and climbed out, his joints protesting after the long drive. The evening chores called to him with the rhythm of routine, cattle to check, water tanks to inspect, the dozen small tasks that kept a ranch operational. But tonight the familiar rituals felt different, shadowed by the brass plaque in his pocket and the impossible paintings still hidden in the mountain hut. "Bear? That you?" The voice came from the barn's open doorway. Luis Vasquez emerged, wiping grease from his hands with a shop rag. Bear's only full-time hand had worked the ranch for 15 years, staying on even when Bear could barely afford to pay him. "Truck's making that noise again," Luis said, nodding toward the red Ford parked near the equipment shed. "Think we're looking at a transmission rebuild." Bear did quick math in his head. 1,500 minimum, money he didn't have. "Can you baby it through calving season?" "Maybe, if we're careful." Luis studied Bear's face in the fading light. "You look like you've seen a ghost, boss. Everything okay?" Bear almost laughed. If only Luis knew what he'd actually seen. "Just tired. You head on home to Maria. I'll finish up here." Luis hesitated. They'd known each other long enough that he could read Bear's moods, knew when to push and when to give space. "Foreclosure notice is still on your kitchen table. 60 days is coming up fast." "I know." The words came out sharper than Bear intended. "I'm working on it." After Luis drove off, Bear walked the property boundaries by habit, checking fence lines he could repair in his sleep. The Hereford cattle gathered near the water tank, their breath visible in the cooling air. These animals represented the culmination of decades of careful breeding, bloodlines that went back to his father's first prize bull. In 60 days, they'd belong to someone else. The thought of strangers walking these pastures, of developers carving the land into suburban lots, made his chest tighten. This wasn't just property. It was the physical manifestation of his family's story, the place where Heinrich Whitmore had proven that a German immigrant could build something lasting in America. But Heinrich's brass plaque burned in Bear's pocket like a guilty secret. What if the family story was built on lies? The house felt cavernous when he stepped inside, too big for one man and heavy with Martha's absence. Her reading chair still sat by the fireplace, a bookmark still marking her place in a biography of Georgia O'Keeffe. Bear had left everything exactly as it was the day she died, as if changing anything would complete the process of losing her. The kitchen table held the foreclosure notice Louise had mentioned, along with a stack of other bills Bear couldn't afford to pay. The local newspaper lay folded beside them, its headline announcing the upcoming Harvest Festival, the annual celebration where Martha had organized the pie auction for 23 years running. The community would gather without her again this year, another reminder that the world moved forward while Bear remained frozen in place. He opened the refrigerator and stared at shelves that held little more than cold beer and leftover takeout from the diner in town. Martha used to fill this kitchen with the smell of fresh bread and Sunday roasts, meals that drew Luis and Maria and their kids, neighbors stopping by, a constant flow of life that had died with her. Bear climbed the stairs to the second floor, each step creaking a familiar tune. The hallway stretched past the master bedroom he couldn't bear to enter, past Martha's sewing room with its half-finished quilts, to the narrow stairs leading to the attic. The pull-chain light revealed decades of accumulated family history, Christmas decorations, boxes of Martha's teaching materials from her years at the elementary school, furniture too good to throw away but too worn to use. In the far corner sat Heinrich's trunk, a leather-bound relic that had traveled from Germany to Montana and then gathered dust for 50 years. Bear knelt beside it, running his fingers over the brass corners and leather straps. Inside this trunk might be answers about the mining consortium, about paintings hidden in mountain caves, about the grandfather who'd raised him on stories of American heroism. He wasn't sure he was ready for what he might find. Bear's hands shook as he worked the trunk's brass clasps, the metal cold and stiff with age. The first clasp gave with a sharp click that seemed too loud in the dusty silence. The second fought him, corroded by decades in the mountain air, before finally surrendering. He lifted the heavy lid, and the smell hit him immediately, leather, mothballs, and something else. Something medicinal and sharp that made his stomach clench. The trunk's contents lay arranged with military precision. Heinrich's marine dress uniform occupied the top layer, the blue wool still immaculate despite its age. Bear lifted it carefully, remembering how his grandfather had worn it to every Veterans Day parade, the chest heavy with ribbons and medals. Beneath the uniform lay photograph albums, official documents, and a collection of items that seemed oddly personal for a war hero's memorabilia. A leather portfolio caught his eye, tied with string and marked personal correspondence in Heinrich's precise handwriting. Bear opened it and found letters written in German, the ink faded but still legible. His grandfather had taught him enough of the language to pick out words: Gemälde, paintings, Sammlung, collection of Verstecken, to Hi. The phone rang downstairs, its shrill tone cutting through the attic's stillness like an alarm. Bear ignored it, his focus consumed by a photograph that had slipped from between the letters. Black and white, slightly blurred, it showed a younger Heinrich standing beside railroad cars. But these weren't American trains. The marking on the side read Deutsche Reichsbahn, and the cars behind Heinrich looked like cattle cars, their doors sealed tight. Bear's chest tightened. Heinrich stood in the photograph, wearing what looked like a German uniform, not the marine blues Bear remembered from family stories. The man beside his grandfather wore an SS officer's peaked cap, his arm raised in casual conversation, a casual smile on his face. The phone stopped ringing, then immediately started again. This time, Bear heard the answering machine click on. Martha's voice floating up from the kitchen with painful clarity. "You've reached the Whitmore Ranch. Please leave a message." The sound of her voice, preserved in electronic amber, made Bear's hands tremble harder. "Mr. Whitmore? This is Dr. Eleanor Hartman from the World Jewish Congress in New York. I'm calling regarding a collection of artwork that may have historical significance to Holocaust survivors. We have reason to believe you may have information relevant to our investigation. Please call me back immediately at—" Bear dropped the photograph and stumbled toward the attic stairs, his heart hammering against his ribs. How could anyone possibly know about the paintings? He'd only discovered them hours ago, and the mountain hut was miles from civilization. But the woman's voice carried an urgency that suggested this wasn't a fishing expedition. He reached the kitchen as the machine clicked off, the red light blinking accusingly in the darkness. Bear stared at it for a long moment, then played the message again. "Dr. Eleanor Hartman, World Jewish Congress, Holocaust survivors." The words felt like physical blows, each one confirming what the photograph had already suggested. His grandfather, the man who'd taught him to fish, who'd carried him on his shoulders during 4th of July parades, who'd died clutching Bear's hand while whispering stories of American heroism, might have been something else entirely. Bear walked to the kitchen window and stared out at the valley that had shaped 4 generations of Whitmores. The same mountains that held Heinrich's secret rose like silent sentinels against the star-filled sky. 60 days until foreclosure, $250 million worth of stolen art hidden in a mountain hut, a grandfather who might have been a Nazi collaborator, and now someone in New York who knew enough to track him down within hours. The smart choice was obvious: drive back up the mountain tomorrow, load the paintings into his truck, and sell them quietly to private collectors who wouldn't ask uncomfortable questions. The money would save the ranch 10 times over, preserve Martha's memory, and keep the Whitmore legacy intact. But the photograph upstairs told a different story. One of families destroyed, treasures stolen, lives ended in cattle cars, while Heinrich Whitmore stood by and smiled. Bear picked up the phone. Dr. Hartman's number still displayed on the caller ID. His finger hovered over the call button. Once he made this call, there would be no going back. Whatever Heinrich had done, whatever secrets the family had carried for 70 years, would come spilling into the light. The foreclosure notice stared at him from the kitchen table. 60 days to save everything his family had built, or lose it all to honor people he'd never met. Bear closed his eyes and saw Martha's face, remembered her voice reading to the children at the elementary school, teaching them that doing the right thing wasn't always the easy thing. He pressed the call button and waited for someone in New York to answer, knowing he was about to tear his world apart. The phone rang once, twice. On the 3rd ring, Bear's nerve cracked and he slammed the handset back into its cradle, his breath coming in short gasps as if he'd just run a mile uphill. The kitchen fell silent except for the tick of Martha's rooster clock on the wall, each second marking time toward the foreclosure deadline. Bear stared at the phone like it might explode, his calloused hand still gripping the receiver. What the hell was he thinking? Once that conversation started, there would be lawyers, investigators, media attention, the kind of scrutiny that would tear through his family's reputation like wildfire through August grass. He walked to the refrigerator and pulled out a beer, his hands still shaking as he twisted off the cap. The first sip burned, but the familiar ritual steadied him enough to think clearly. Maybe the woman's call was a coincidence. Maybe she was investigating dozens of families with German heritage, casting a wide net and hoping for leads. Heinrich had been a respected member of this community for 40 years after the war, coached Little League, donated to the church, served on the school board. War heroes didn't collaborate with Nazis. But that photograph upstairs told a different story. Bear found himself walking toward the living room, toward the mantelpiece where 3 generations of Whitmore men stared down from their frames. His great-grandfather, Otto, stern-faced in sepia, who'd homesteaded this valley with nothing but determination and a borrowed plough. His father, William, captured in Kodachrome during his own military service in Korea, the bronze star visible on his dress uniform. And Heinrich, young and proud in marine dress blues, the American flag draped behind him. Which Heinrich was real? The war hero who'd raised him with stories of Guadalcanal and Iwo Jima, or the man in the German photograph standing beside cattle cars and SS officers? The foreclosure notice seemed to mock him from the kitchen table. 60 days. He could drive back to the mountain tomorrow, load those paintings into his truck, and have them sold within a week. Private collectors paid cash, asked few questions, and dealt in the grey areas where provenance mattered less than beauty and rarity. $250 million would save the ranch, pay off every debt, and leave him wealthy beyond anything the Whitmore family had ever imagined. All he had to do was ignore the possibility that those masterpieces had been torn from the walls of Jewish homes while families were herded onto trains. Bear took another pull of beer and tried to imagine explaining the situation to Martha. She'd always been the family's moral compass, the one who insisted they donate to the food bank even during lean years, who'd spent her summers teaching literacy to migrant workers' children without expecting payment. What would she say about keeping stolen art to save their home? But Martha was gone, and she'd never have to watch strangers bulldoze the cottonwoods she'd loved, never see developers carve their valley into suburban streets named after trees they'd cut down. The living had to make choices the dead didn't have to face. His phone buzzed with a text message. "Unknown number, Mr. Whitmore. This is Dr. Hartman. I understand this is overwhelming. I'm not going away. Others are coming who won't be as patient or reasonable as I am. Please call me." Bear read the message 3 times, his stomach churning. Others were coming. That suggested competition, people who might not care about legal niceties or rightful ownership. The art world attracted sharks. He'd learned that much from Martha's PBS documentaries, and $250 million would draw them from every corner of the globe. He walked back upstairs to the attic, his legs heavy as concrete. Heinrich's trunk gaped open like a mouth ready to swallow secrets. Bear knelt beside it and pulled out more photographs, hoping to find evidence that would exonerate his grandfather, proof that the German uniform meant something innocent. Instead, he found a detailed inventory written in Heinrich's hand, listing paintings by artists Bear recognized from Martha's art books: Monet, Picasso, Degas, Van Gogh. Beside each entry was a notation that made his blood run cold: addresses in Berlin, Vienna, Amsterdam. Jewish-sounding names crossed out in red ink. The page trembled in Bear's hands. This wasn't confusion or misidentification. This was a shopping list of stolen treasures, a catalogue of cultural genocide documented with bureaucratic precision. Dr. Hartman's business card lay on the kitchen counter when he came back downstairs, though he couldn't remember writing down her information. Her direct line was scrawled in his own handwriting, along with a note: 24/7 emergency contact. Time sensitive. Bear stared at the card until the numbers blurred together. Calling her would mean acknowledging that Heinrich Whitmore, decorated veteran, beloved grandfather, pillar of the community, had been living a lie for 70 years. It would mean accepting that the Whitmore legacy was built on blood money, that 4 generations of honest ranching couldn't wash away the stain of collaboration. But not calling her would mean becoming complicit in that lie, adding his own name to the list of people who chose profit over justice. The rooster clock ticked toward midnight, marking another day closer to foreclosure, another step toward losing everything his family had built on land his great-grandfather had earned through honest sweat, unless he was willing to keep it through honest theft. Bear stood in his kitchen, Dr. Hartman's business card between his trembling fingers, watching the rooster clock's minute hand crawl toward 12. The decision hung before him like a cliff's edge: step forward into the unknown, or retreat into comfortable lies that would crumble anyway when the foreclosure came due. He thought about Martha's last words in the hospital, her hand squeezing his with surprising strength. "Don't let the hard choices make you into someone I wouldn't recognize." She'd been talking about her medical bills, about the crushing debt that was slowly strangling their ranch, but the words carried deeper weight now. Bear picked up the phone and dialed before he could lose his nerve again. "Dr. Hartman." The voice was crisp, professional, but not unkind. New York efficient. "This is Samuel Whitmore, from Montana. You called about—" His voice cracked like a teenager's. "Mr. Whitmore, thank you for calling back. I know this must be difficult." A pause, the sound of papers rustling. "I'm going to be direct because time matters here. We have intelligence suggesting your grandfather Heinrich was involved with the Nazi art theft program. We believe he may have hidden stolen works in Montana before his immigration to the United States." The words hit Bear like physical blows. Intelligence from who? Recently declassified OSS documents. Your grandfather's name appears on lists of German personnel involved in what the Nazis called cultural preservation. We know he entered the United States in 1947 with papers that don't quite match his military record. And 3 hours ago, a dealer in Zurich contacted us about someone making inquiries regarding authentication of specific works that match pieces reported stolen from the Rosenberg collection in Amsterdam. Bear's blood went cold. "I haven't contacted anyone in Zurich." "Perhaps not. But someone has, Mr. Whitmore. And in this business, word travels fast. If you've found something, others will know soon enough. People who won't care about rightful ownership or historical justice." Bear walked to the kitchen window, the phone cord stretching tight. His cattle were dark shapes against the moonlit pasture, peaceful and unaware that their world was about to change forever. "What exactly are you asking me to do?" "Tell me what you've found. Let us help you determine the rightful ownership. These aren't just paintings, Mr. Whitmore. They're the last physical connection Holocaust survivors have to families that were murdered. Every piece we recover gives someone back a fragment of their stolen history. And if I refuse—" Dr. Hartman's silence stretched long enough that Bear wondered if the connection had dropped. "Finally. Then you become complicit in your grandfather's crimes. And when the art dealers and private collectors descend on your ranch, and they will, you'll face them alone." Bear closed his eyes and saw Heinrich's inventory again, those red lines through Jewish names like headstones in a ledger. "How long do I have?" "To decide?" "You don't. Word is already out that something significant has surfaced. I can be in Montana tomorrow morning with a team of experts and security personnel. We can document everything, establish chain of custody, begin the repatriation process properly." "Repatriation," Bear repeated. "Which means I lose everything. Which means you do the right thing." "Mr. Whitmore, I've spent 15 years reuniting families with stolen art. I've seen grown men weep over finding their grandmother's paintings, their father's sculpture collection, tangible proof that their loved ones existed and had lives worth stealing. That's what this is really about." Bear looked at the foreclosure notice on his table. "I'm losing my ranch, my wife's medical bills, drought, cattle prices. I'm 62 years old and about to lose everything 4 generations of my family built. I understand that's painful, but those families lost everything too. The difference is they lost it to genocide." The words hung in the kitchen air like smoke. Bear knew she was right, knew that keeping stolen art to save his ranch would make him everything Heinrich pretended not to be. But understanding the moral equation didn't make the choice easier. "If I cooperate, if I let you document everything and return it to the families, what happens to me?" "You become a hero instead of an accomplice. The World Jewish Congress has programs to recognize people who help with repatriation. We can work with the government on tax considerations for voluntary cooperation. And Mr. Whitmore, you'll be able to sleep at night." Bear walked back to the mantelpiece, studying Heinrich's photograph in its place of honor. The man who'd taught him to fish, who'd carried him on his shoulders, who'd hidden $250 million in stolen art and taken the secret to his grave. "Dr. Hartman, I'll meet you at the Billings airport tomorrow, but I'm driving you to the site myself. If I'm about to lose everything, I want to understand exactly what my grandfather did." "Of course. Mr. Whitmore, you're making the right choice." Bear hung up and stared at his reflection in the dark window, seeing a stranger who'd just agreed to destroy his own life to honor people he'd never met. There was no going back now. Bear stood frozen in his own kitchen, the silence after the phone call feeling heavier than the words that had just ended his world. The reflection in the dark window showed a man who'd aged 10 years in 10 minutes, hollow-eyed, shoulders sagging under the weight of promises he wasn't sure he could keep. Sleep was impossible. He wandered the house until dawn, touching familiar objects like a man saying goodbye, Martha's reading glasses still folded on her nightstand, the coffee mug she'd painted in a pottery class that he'd never had the heart to use, the stack of ranch ledgers documenting 4 generations of honest struggle. At first light, Bear loaded his truck with supplies and drove toward Billings, his mind churning through everything that could go wrong. Dr. Hartman's warning echoed in his head. Others were coming who wouldn't be patient or reasonable. He'd spent his life dealing with cattle thieves and land developers, but art dealers operated in a different world entirely, one where $250 stakes attracted the kind of people who didn't respect property lines or Montana courtesy. The Billings airport was busier than Bear expected for a Thursday morning. He parked outside the terminal and checked his phone. Dr. Hartman's flight had landed 20 minutes early. He was studying the arrivals board when a woman's voice cut through the crowd noise behind him. "Mr. Whitmore?" Bear turned to find a small, sharp-featured woman in her 50s approaching with purposeful strides. Dr. Eleanor Hartman looked exactly like her voice suggested, precise, professional, carrying herself with the confidence of someone accustomed to difficult conversations. A younger man followed 2 steps behind, loaded down with equipment cases and looking like he'd rather be anywhere else. Dr. Hartman. Bear shook her offered hand, surprised by the strength of her grip. "Thank you for coming. This is James Morrison, our documentation specialist." She gestured toward the younger man, who nodded nervously while juggling camera cases. "He'll handle the initial cataloging and photography." "How far is the site?" 3 hours into the mountains. Rough terrain. Hope you brought hiking boots." Dr. Hartman lifted one leg slightly, revealing well-worn hiking boots beneath her business slacks. "I've crawled through bombed-out basements in Berlin and hidden chambers in Swiss bank vaults. I think I can handle Montana." As they loaded the truck, Bear noticed Dr. Hartman scanning the parking lot with the practiced eye of someone expecting trouble. Something wrong? Professional paranoia. When word gets out about discoveries this significant, it attracts attention from people who prefer to work in shadows. She climbed into the passenger seat and pulled out a tablet. "Tell me about your grandfather while we drive. Everything you know about his war service, his immigration, his life after arriving in Montana." Bear navigated through Billings traffic while recounting Heinrich's story, the version he'd grown up believing. Marine veteran, Guadalcanal survivor, homesteader who'd helped build the community. As he talked, Dr. Hartman took notes, occasionally asking pointed questions that revealed gaps in the family narrative Bear had never noticed. He never spoke about his time in Europe before the war. Never. Said it was too painful to discuss. Immigration records? Burned in a courthouse fire in the 70s, along with most of the early ranch documents. "Convenient," Dr. Hartman murmured, making another note. "Mr. Whitmore, what I'm about to tell you might be difficult to hear. Our research suggests your grandfather wasn't born Heinrich Whitmore. OSS documents reference a Heinrich Weissmann who worked with Nazi art acquisition units in occupied territories, a man who disappeared from Allied custody in 1947, right around the time your grandfather appeared in Montana with suspiciously clean paperwork." Bear's hands tightened on the steering wheel. "You're saying he stole someone's identity?" "I'm saying the timing raises questions. Questions that might be answered by what we find in that mountain hut." They stopped for lunch in Red Lodge, the last real town before entering the wilderness. Bear noticed Dr. Hartman checking her phone constantly, her expression growing more concerned with each message. Finally, she looked up from the screen with grim determination. "We have a problem. Word about this discovery has reached people we'd rather avoid. There's a private collector named Viktor Kozlov who specializes in acquiring disputed works through aggressive means. His people were asking questions in Zurich this morning about Nazi-era pieces that match your grandfather's inventory. What kind of aggressive means? The kind that make legal ownership a moot point. Dr. Hartman's voice carried the weight of experience. Mr. Whitmore, once we reach that hut and begin documentation, we need to work quickly. Kozlov's people won't respect your cooperation with legitimate authorities. Bear pushed his untouched sandwich away. Maybe I should have kept my mouth shut. And become complicit in genocide? I don't think that's who you are. Dr. Hartman leaned forward, her eyes intense. Your grandfather made his choices 70 years ago. Now you get to make yours. We can do this right, or we can let vultures pick the bones clean. Bear looked out at the mountains rising ahead, knowing that somewhere in those peaks lay the truth about Heinrich Whitmore, and the test of who Samuel Whitmore would choose to become. The gravel road to the trailhead wound through dense pines, each turn taking them deeper into wilderness that had remained unchanged since Heinrich first walked these mountains. Bear's truck groaned up the steep switchbacks while Dr. Hartman studied topographic maps, plotting their approach to the hidden hut. "How much farther to where we leave the vehicle?" she asked, her finger tracing elevation lines. "Another 20 minutes to the old logging road, then it's 2 hours on foot." Bear glanced at the equipment cases rattling in his truck bed. "You sure your man can handle all that gear on rough terrain?" Dr. Hartman looked back at Morrison, who was gripping his door handle with white knuckles as they navigated another hairpin curve. "James has documented recoveries in worse conditions. He'll manage." But Bear caught the uncertainty in her voice. Morrison looked like he'd be more comfortable in a climate-controlled museum than scrambling up mountain trails with 50 pounds of camera equipment. The forest pressed closer as they climbed, towering Douglas firs blocking most of the afternoon sun. Bear had hunted these mountains for 40 years, but today the familiar landscape felt threatening, full of hidden watchers and unknown dangers. Every time another vehicle appeared on the narrow road, a Forest Service truck, a hunter's pickup, he found himself checking his mirrors to see if they were being followed. "Tell me about your wife," Dr. Hartman said suddenly, startling Bear from his paranoid observations. "Martha? What's that got to do with anything? You mentioned her medical bills were part of your financial difficulties. Was she supportive of your decision to contact us?" Bear's throat tightened. "She died 8 months ago. Cancer." The words came out harder than he'd intended. But if she were alive, she'd have made the same choice I did. "Martha always said a person's character shows up most clearly when nobody's watching." Dr. Hartman nodded respectfully. "I'm sorry for your loss. It sounds like she was a good influence. She was the best of us." Bear downshifted for another steep grade, the truck's engines straining. Martha taught school for 30 years, never made much money, but she changed hundreds of kids' lives. When we found out about her diagnosis, I wanted to sell cattle, mortgage the ranch, whatever it took for the best treatment. She wouldn't hear of it. Said we couldn't destroy 4 generations of family land for a few more months that might not work anyway. She sounds like someone who understood sacrifice. She understood that some things matter more than comfort. That's why I know she'd approve of what we're doing, even if it costs us everything. The truck crested a ridge, and suddenly the high peaks of the Bitterroot Range sprawled before them, snow-capped summits, catching the afternoon light like broken glass. Morrison leaned forward between the seats, finally showing interest. "Oh my God, it's beautiful up here. How did your grandfather find this place?" Heinrich spent months exploring these mountains after the war. Claimed he was hunting and fishing, but now I wonder if he was scouting hiding spots. Bear pulled off at a widening in the road where a rusted gate blocked access to an overgrown track. "This is as far as we drive." They spent 20 minutes distributing equipment and supplies among 3 backpacks. Morrison struggled with the weight, adjusting straps and muttering about the wisdom of bringing so much documentation gear. Dr. Hartman moved with practiced efficiency, her pack loaded and secured before Bear had finished checking his own supplies. "Once we're up there and start photographing the collection, How long will the documentation process take? Bear asked as they set off on the trail. Depends on what we find. If it's truly the Rosenberg collection, we're looking at 2 or 3 days minimum for proper catalogue work. Dr. Hartman paused to check her GPS device. But given the security concerns, we may need to work faster. Document everything, secure the most valuable pieces, then establish a proper preservation environment back in civilization. The trail climbed steeply through stands of aspen and pine, their boots crunching on decades of fallen leaves. Bear set a steady pace, but Morrison was already breathing hard after the first half-mile. They would need to take frequent breaks, which meant more time exposed in the mountains, more opportunity for unwanted attention. Dr. Hartman, this Victor Kozlov you mentioned, how worried should I be about him? She stopped to let Morrison catch up, her expression grim. Kozlov operates a network of acquisition specialists who work in the grey areas between legal and criminal. He's been connected to thefts from private collections, museums, even active archaeological sites. If he wants something, he usually gets it. How would he even know about the hut's location? That's what concerns me. Our communications should have been secure, but information has a way of leaking when this much money is involved. She resumed hiking, her pace urgent now. We need to assume we're working on borrowed time. Bear felt the weight of his grandfather's secrets pressing down like the mountain air itself, growing heavier with each step toward whatever truth waited in Heinrich's hidden chamber. The last quarter-mile to Heinrich's hut climbed through terrain that had probably never seen human footprints besides Bear's and his grandfather's. Ancient deadfall created a natural maze, forcing them to scramble over moss-covered logs and duck under low-hanging branches that caught at Morrison's equipment like grasping fingers. Dr. Hartman moved with surprising agility for a woman in her 50s, but Morrison was struggling badly now, his face flushed red despite the mountain chill. "Jesus!" Morrison gasped, stopping to lean against a boulder. "How did an old man haul anything up here?" "Heinrich was tougher than most," Bear replied, though he was wondering the same thing. Hauling hundreds of paintings up this trail would have required multiple trips over years, each journey a monumental effort for a man who would have been well into his 60s when he started. They crested a narrow ridge, and Bear saw the hut exactly as he'd left it, a weathered structure that looked ready to collapse under the next heavy snow. But now, knowing what lay beneath those rotting floorboards, the innocuous building seemed to radiate menace. "That's it?" Morrison squinted at the humble cabin. "Doesn't look like much." Dr. Hartman was studying the approach with tactical intensity, perfect hiding spot, completely invisible from any direction until you're practically on top of it. She pulled out binoculars and scanned the surrounding forest. No sign of recent disturbance. We might actually be here first. Bear unlocked the padlock he'd added after his last visit and pushed open the sagging door. The hut's interior looked exactly as Heinrich had left it. A few pieces of primitive furniture, camping supplies, nothing to suggest the fortune hidden below. But as Dr. Hartman stepped inside and swept her flashlight beam across the floorboards, Bear saw the space through her expert eyes, the deliberately uneven planks, the strategic placement of the old trunk, the subtle but careful camouflage work. "Your grandfather was thorough," she murmured, kneeling beside the hidden entrance. "This construction required serious planning. Help me move this trunk." Together they shifted Heinrich's heavy chest, revealing the concealed trapdoor. Bear lifted the panel, and Morrison's equipment lights flooded into the chamber below, illuminating the canvas-wrapped shapes that had haunted Bear's dreams for weeks. "Mother of God," Morrison whispered. Dr. Hartman descended into the chamber first, her movements reverent and careful. Bear watched her face as she examined the closest painting, saw the exact moment when academic theory became devastating reality. Her hands shook slightly as she pulled back a corner of protective canvas. "It's real," she breathed. "This is definitely Rosenberg collection work. Look at this." She indicated numbers penciled on the painting's frame, inventory markings. Your grandfather kept detailed records. Bear climbed down into the chamber, feeling the weight of history pressing against him from every direction. Dr. Hartman, I need you to tell me exactly what Heinrich did. Not the sanitized version, the truth. She looked up from the painting, her expression heavy with knowledge Bear wasn't sure he wanted to possess. Art confiscation units followed Nazi occupation forces into every conquered territory. They had lists. Jewish families, prominent collectors, museums. They would arrive at homes, sometimes before the families were even deported, and strip everything of value. And Heinrich was part of that? Based on what I'm seeing here, yes. These pieces show signs of hasty removal, torn canvas edges, damaged frames. This wasn't careful museum-quality acquisition. This was theft. Her voice carried decades of anger at crimes she'd dedicated her life to correcting. The families that owned these paintings were probably murdered within weeks of the confiscation. Bear felt something fundamental breaking inside him, the last connection to the grandfather he'd loved and admired snapping like an overstressed rope. How many families? Morrison was photographing everything with methodical precision, but Dr. Hartman's attention remained focused on Bear, dozens probably. Each piece represents a family's heritage, their culture, their wealth, everything stolen and scattered to the winds. Bear picked up Heinrich's inventory ledger with hands that felt disconnected from his body. The neat German handwriting that had once seemed quaint now looked like a criminal's record-keeping. Each red line through a Jewish name represented not just stolen art, but stolen lives, stolen futures. Mr. Whitmore. Dr. Hartman's voice was gentle but urgent. We need to work quickly. Once word gets out about the recovery, this place will become very dangerous. As if summoned by her warning, Morrison suddenly hissed from above them. Someone's coming? I can hear engines on the trail. Bear felt his stomach drop toward his boots. They'd been at the hut less than 30 minutes, barely begun documenting the collection, and already the vultures were circling. How many? Dr. Hartman was already moving toward the ladder, her professional calm cracking. Sounds like multiple vehicles, maybe motorcycles or ATVs, something that can handle rough terrain. Bear's hand instinctively moved toward the rifle he'd brought, then stopped. Whatever was coming up that mountain trail represented the collision of two worlds, his grandfather's buried sins and the modern consequences of choices made 70 years ago. The ordeal had truly begun. The sound of engines grew louder, echoing off the mountain walls like mechanical thunder. Bear counted at least 3 different motors, their high-pitched whines suggesting ATVs or dirt bikes, vehicles built for terrain that would stop conventional cars. Whatever was coming had been planned specifically for this remote location. Up the ladder, now, Bear commanded, grabbing the inventory ledger and stuffing it inside his jacket. Dr. Hartman was already climbing, but Morrison fumbled with his camera equipment, trying to protect thousands of dollars worth of documentation gear. Leave it, Dr. Hartman snapped from above. We can replace cameras. We can't replace our lives. Bear pulled the trapdoor closed as Morrison scrambled up behind him, the hidden chamber vanishing beneath innocent-looking floorboards. But there was no hiding their presence. Fresh footprints led directly to the hut, and their backpacks lay scattered around the interior like evidence markers at a crime scene. Through the single grimy window, Bear caught flashes of movement through the trees, dark shapes weaving between the pines, moving with predatory purpose, professional hunters who knew exactly where they were going. Back exit? Dr. Hartman whispered. Bear shook his head. Heinrich had built this place with only one way in or out, probably to control access to his secrets, but now it trapped them like mice in a cage. The first ATV broke through the tree line 50 yards away, its rider scanning the area with military precision. 2 more machines followed, their occupants dressed in black tactical gear that looked wildly out of place in the Montana wilderness. Friends of yours? Morrison's voice cracked with fear. Bear pulled his hunting rifle from its case, the familiar weight providing cold comfort. Stay low and don't move unless I say so. The lead rider killed his engine and dismounted, pulling off his helmet to reveal a face that belonged in a boardroom, not a battlefield. Pale skin, expensive haircut, designer sunglasses that probably cost more than Bear made in a month. The other two riders remained mounted, engines idling, ready for quick movement. "Mr. Whitmore," the man called out, his accent carrying hints of Eastern Europe. "I believe we should talk. I am here on behalf of Victor Kozlov, and we have mutual interests to discuss." Dr. Hartman grabbed Bear's arm. "Don't answer him. Kozlov's people aren't here to negotiate. They're here to take everything and eliminate witnesses." But the choice was taken from Bear as Morrison suddenly stood up, panic overriding judgment. "We're just documenting historical artifacts. This is legitimate research." The man's smile was winter cold. "Ah, Dr. Hartman, I presume. Your reputation precedes you. Mr. Kozlov has great respect for your work recovering lost treasures. He simply believes private collectors can provide better security than bureaucratic institutions. Tell your boss that stolen art belongs to its rightful owners, not Russian oligarchs," Dr. Hartman replied, her voice steady despite their desperate situation. Such noble sentiment, but ownership is a fluid concept when dealing with wartime acquisitions. Your grandfather understood this, Mr. Whitmore. Heinrich Weissmann was quite practical about the realities of survival. Bear felt the last fragments of his family mythology crumbling. Even Kozlov's people knew more about Heinrich's true identity than his own grandson had. "What do you want?" "Cooperation. You continue your documentation work while my associates ensure nothing valuable disappears into government warehouses. Everyone benefits, you save your ranch, Dr. Hartman preserves historical artifacts, and my employer acquires some beautiful pieces for private appreciation." A second engine shut off, and Bear realized one of the riders was moving to flank their position. These weren't random criminals. They operated with tactical coordination that suggested military training. "And if we refuse?" Bear asked, though he already knew the answer. Mountain accidents are tragically common. 3 researchers, overwhelmed by altitude and terrain, lost forever in the wilderness. Their valuable discovery would require new management, of course. Dr. Hartman was checking her phone, her face grim. No signal. They probably have jammers. Bear understood with crystalline clarity that his attempt to do the right thing had led them into a trap with no good exits. Heinrich's sins had finally caught up with the Whitmore family, and the bill was being presented to the wrong generation. Morrison suddenly bolted for the door, apparently believing he could outrun trained professionals on their own chosen ground. He made it 3 steps outside before the flanking rider appeared from behind the hut, casually pointing what looked like a military-grade weapon. "Please return to your friends," the rider said calmly. "We would prefer to keep this civilized." Bear watched Morrison stumble back inside, tears of terror streaming down his face, and realized that his grandfather's buried secrets had just destroyed everything Bear had tried to build. The ranch would be lost anyway, along with their lives and any hope of justice for Heinrich's victims. 70 years after the crime, the evil was still spreading, still claiming new victims. And Bear was powerless to stop it.